I wanted to say what a privilege it is for me to be here with you. I've been acquainted with this congregation for more than 50 years, and so it's been a privilege for me to be here this morning. And it's been a privilege also for me to share this worship service with Lois. What she did not mention to you was that when we were in Crystal Lake, she was the babysitter for our children. And they loved her very much, as did my wife and me. Lois was 16 when we arrived there, and we're so proud to see her move and develop and be now a co-pastor here at this congregation. I want to thank Dennis for the reading this morning. The way in which it was presented, and I'm hoping that you followed along with him. But just to recap a little bit, the first reading from Matthew was Matthew's recording of how after the wise men departed, and there was the flight to Egypt by Joseph and Mary and the Christ child, after Joseph was made aware that King Herod wanted to kill the child. The second reading that Dennis read was the parable of the Last Judgment. In the end of days, Jesus is sitting on his throne of glory and will separate the sheep from the goats. And we all know that this parable is not about barn animals, but rather it is about all nations of people. And they are separated to the left and to the right of Jesus. And to those on the right comes the invitation to inherit the blessings of God because they cared and ministered to Jesus when he was hungry and thirsty, naked, sick, and homeless. And the righteous are confused. When did we see you in those circumstances, Jesus, and minister to you? And the answer comes whenever you helped anyone in need, even the least among you. Anytime you helped them and ministered to them, you did it to me. And then Jesus had some very harsh words to those on his left. He said, there were times when I was really in need, hungry, thirsty, naked, homeless, sick, and you chose to ignore me. And they too then are stunned. They can't believe what they're hearing. When did we ever see you in such situations, under those circumstances? And again, the answer, whenever you chose to ignore me, whenever you chose to ignore even the least among you, anyone, you chose to ignore me. So it is these two scripture passages that I kept parallel in my mind as I prepared this morning's message. Matthew doesn't give us the details of what it must have been like for the Holy Family to be refugees as they fled their homeland and entered Egypt, a land that was completely foreign to them. Matthew doesn't tell us if the family encountered a border patrol or a border wall or barbed wire or anything like that. Almost all biblical scholars indicate that the family must have spent at least 7 years in Egypt. And so how did Joseph support himself and support the family in all those years? And how were they treated by the Egyptians during that time? Did someone have compassion upon them when they first entered the Egypt, giving them shelter and aid until they were able to care for themselves? Just as you did it to anyone, even the least among you, you did it to me. And as time went by, what was Joseph's experience? Did he hear things like, "Hey, Jew, we overheard you speaking to your wife. If you're going to speak and talk here in Egypt, you better learn the Egyptian language. We don't want to hear any Hebrew here in Egypt." Or maybe Joseph heard things like, "Go back where you came from. We have enough carpenters here in Egypt, and you're just taking jobs away from one of our own." Maybe he heard something like, "That kid that you brought with you, we know his kind. He was going to grow up to be a criminal and a rapist. You better take him and his mother back where you came from now." Matthew doesn't say. So we really don't know, but we do know that it could have happened because it happens now among us. It must have been difficult for Joseph and Mary to leave Bethlehem, leave their homeland, leave the place where they were showered by love and praise and gifts and wise ones, now out into the unknown. What were the messages that they heard now being there in Egypt? Just as you did it to one of the least of these among you, you did it to me. Here in the warmth of this sanctuary, on Christmas Eve, I can well imagine what it was like here. Very much like it was in the church in which I worshiped on Christmas Eve, where I hold membership. Another United Church of Christ, Congregational Church of St. Charles. So what I experienced there, I'm quite sure all of you experienced right here in Elgin, in this same sanctuary. I'm sure that you heard in the warmth of this sanctuary the wonderful story, Christmas story, read and repeated again. You heard a wonderful message by your pastor, and there were the songs from several sources, and you sang the old and familiar carols. And after the church service was over with, there was the greetings and the smiles and the warm wishes of Merry Christmas, the firm handshakes and the embraces and the hugs of longtime friends. And I'm sure there were the former confirmation students had come back with families of their own, with wonderful family reunions. What a warm and wonderful feeling there was here, as it was where I worshiped. But then, as I stepped out into the midnight air, as I left the Bethlehem stable and into the flight to Egypt, I heard no angels. I heard no wise men. I heard only the cries and the fleeing refugees from Syria, Aleppo, and the anguish and distress and uncertainty that they carry with them. I heard the cries of survivors of those of the massacre in Las Vegas, and those who are still recuperating and recovering from the floods of Houston, Texas. The cries of those who were victims of hurricanes that swept through Florida and Puerto Rico. And I heard the cries of those who lost everything in the fires of California. Yes, and I heard the cries of those who live in Chicago and in other metropolitan areas across our nation, who find violence and murder as a rule of every day. I could hear the fear and the voices of those who are living among us, but who many years ago, decades ago, came here illegally, seeking a better life for themselves and for their families. They lived here for many, many years as law-abiding, working people, contributing to our society, who raised their children who were born in this country. But now they are facing deportation and separation from their children, from their neighbors and friends, deported to a country they no longer know. And they have heard also of children coming home from school, finding a meal still being warmed on the stove, but their parents are gone, deported, never to be seen again. And they worry that it could happen to them. Just as you have done it unto the least of these, you have done it unto me. I could hear the voices and fears and uncertainty among our Muslim citizens who feared the assaults of misguided neighbors, fear for their places of worship, fear for their children, fear for what might come from some of our elected leaders. This, then, is the kind of world in which Jesus was born and the kind of world in which we live. And I'm not going to suggest that we leave Christmas behind, but rather that we take Christmas and the Christ child with us into our world of reality. I can say proudly that even though I do not know in detail the mission program of this church, but because you are a United Church of Christ, as I am, I know what you are all about and how you extend your ministry and your mission out beyond these four walls. How you must probably support things like food pantries and shelter for homeless, as well as giving to missions such as Biloxi or other church-related institutions, and even those organizations beyond our own United Church of Christ. Like I say, I don't know. I don't know the details. I haven't studied what you do, but you are a United Church of Christ, and I know because of that you extend your ministry of compassion and concern for those who are in need. Because just as we do it even to the least among us, we do it to the child of Bethlehem. Do I dare make a bold suggestion? And I know that it's bold of me to even suggest it being from the outside. I'm not a resident of Elgin. But do I dare suggest that if the leaders of Elgin decided to make this community a sanctuary city, would you give it its support? Would you even give it consideration? Would you be willing to talk about it? And do I dare being even more bold in saying, could this church be a sanctuary church? Finally, there is the ongoing world hunger. In a few months, our denomination, the United Church of Christ, will have the observance of 1 great hour of sharing. You will observe it just as we do in St. Charles. It's a program which supports church world service for those who are in desperate need the world over, including people in our own country. Daily starvation by the hundreds, especially among children, is a reality. Do I dare suggest that this year our dollar gifts is much more than token giving, that we dig deep in our pockets, that we prayerfully consider what we possibly can afford to give to this worthwhile ministry. For inasmuch as we do it unto the least among us, we do it to Christ. No other charitable organization comes even close to church world service in maximizing our dollars to those in need. No other organization comes even close to what Church World Service does. In closing, I want to share with you an experience I had with Dr. Fred Craddock, one of the more popular preachers of our day, who rather recently, had died. And I had the privilege of hearing Fred Craddock several occasions in convocations and conferences. At one such occasion, I, by accident, had the privilege of sitting right across the table from him as we were having our meal. And during that time, he shared with us, those of us that were close enough to his hearing, a time when he was invited to speak at a conference that was emphasizing the problem of world hunger. And he said he was sitting on a stage in a very large auditorium that was just filled to capacity. And he was sitting up there waiting to be introduced when a young woman, someone about in her mid-20s, got up to give the meditation. He described her as tall and slender, pale, blonde, wore no makeup at all. And as she began, he thought there must be something wrong with her mic because he did not understand what she was saying. And so he leaned forward to be more attentive to what she was saying. But she went on, and eventually he came to realize that she was saying the same thing over and over again, but each time in a different language, never repeating herself. For 60 or 70 times, he said, she was saying the same thing, but each time in a different language. And it wasn't until she ended it with English that he understood what she was saying. And all that time, in the languages of the world, she was saying, "Mommy, I'm hungry." Fred said he gave his speech, but as he was driving home that night and on the bypass of Atlanta, Georgia, a large lighted sign loomed up ahead of him, and it read, "All you can eat for $8.99. But all he could think about was, "Mommy, I'm hungry." Just as you did it unto one of the least. Amen.